Welcome back. Also, I'm genuinely sorry for how long it's taken to put out another video. There are legitimate excuses for that, but also illegitimate excuses. There are just things that have been going wrong with recording videos and stuff. So we're back, we're doing it, and this is going to be kind of a quick rapid fire video given brief takes on a number of animated Netflix shows and movies that I watched recently, because basically I'm in the process of getting kicked off of the different Netflix accounts that I was using to watch stuff, because that's what they're doing now, and the other streaming services will soon follow suit. So, still unsure of whether or not I want to keep Netflix in the long run for myself. I thought I would kind of clean house a little bit, check out some shows and movies that I've been meaning to get around to and just haven't for whatever reason. So that's what we're doing today. Thanks for joining us. Nimona is, I think, already pretty darn famous for a lot of folks who are just into animation generally, and anyone who follows kind of the business side of animation, because this was originally a project over at Blue Sky, and then Blue Sky was bought out by Disney, of course, who else? And the story goes that Disney canned this project specifically because of gay elements, gay romance in this movie. And I believe that wholeheartedly. That's absolutely something Disney would do, despite their sort of outward messaging and optics about being so inclusive and everything. They couldn't make it, and Blue Sky is dead. Blue Sky has been dead for a good while now. So it got, I assume, sold off to another studio here, and finally produced and distributed through Netflix. So here it is. And what we have here, I think, is one of those movies where it definitely matters more how it's actually impacting people in the real world, more than anything that I have to say about it. I will share my thoughts, of course, but I want to make it very clear that my thoughts don't mean much, well, most of the time, but especially in this instance. If this is really reaching people, and it does seem like it really has had a positive response so far, both critically and in terms of general audiences, and that's great. I'm really happy about that, and that means it was successful. With that said, the visuals here are absolutely one of the greatest accomplishments of this movie, and more specifically than that, I think possibly the best aspect of the art direction of Nimona is the way that faces work in this movie. I don't know if they're doing something special to kind of highlight faces, or maybe in HDR there's some light coming out of the eyes, or something along those lines. It looks great in HDR, by the way. It's a really great looking movie. But faces especially, wow, they look so fantastic. And beyond that, we also have a shape-shifting character here, if you were unaware. So that gives the team just the perfect excuse to do all kinds of crazy, neat, creative creature designs, and they all look absolutely lovely. It's sort of as a lead-in to talking about the messaging and the writing of this movie and everything, I want to talk about what I'm setting apart as two opposites, or two sides of a sliding scale. On one side, we have movies that feel more contemporary, meaning they feel closer to the time in which they were made, and on the other side of the scale is movies that feel a bit more timeless. They don't have as many things connecting them directly to the time in which they were made. Obviously, every movie, there are always going to be clues as to when it was made, and you get a sense of the team behind it and all those details, but in general, in terms of tone and execution, and especially in writing, I think there are movies that feel more timeless, and I think there are movies that feel more contemporary. Neither of those things is better or worse. These are just creative choices that are made when making a movie, or a show for that matter. And in the case of Nimona, I would say that this is definitely a movie that feels much more contemporary. It feels incredibly current, despite the fact that our setting here, it's a mix of sci-fi. We just say cyberpunk now for everything in the future, right? That's just the blanket term everybody's using, but it's neon, bright colors, very sleek designs for everything. And then we also have that combined with medieval influence. Maybe there's a specific reason for that in the lore of this world or something. I don't think that combination necessarily really worked for me. But again, despite the setting of like the distant past and the distant future pushed together, it feels very much like something made in the year 2023. Very much of its time. And that comes down to its general sense of humor. I think obviously visuals and visual technology behind the CG, of course, is part of that as well. But also the dialogue here is extremely contemporary. There's a lot of slang. It's very referencey, it's very quippy, which is indeed a dialogue trend even that's been around for a while, but I promise it will go away eventually. That will start to feel a little bit old-fashioned as time goes on, but that's how it feels. It feels like something brand new, and I would argue that the team's choice here to make the movie feel more contemporary as opposed to timeless is that they want the messaging of the movie to also feel really contemporary. They want that messaging to have a huge amount of impact for their target audience right now. And I would have to guess that their target audience is like tweens, certainly younger viewers in general. But yeah, they want to reach people, and specifically it feels like they want to reach people who feel otherized. They want to feel people, they want to talk to people who feel marginalized and offer support. This is all just my interpretation, of course, but the messaging is objectively just like, you know, exclusion bad, oppressive ideologies bad, and talking about the importance of questioning norms that might be harmful even if you yourself are not someone who is harmed by those norms. That's fantastic. That's a lovely message. I am completely on board with all of that. As to whether the messaging is effective, again, that's something that really depends on how other people are responding to the movie as opposed to how I am responding to the movie. And for me, it is mostly effective messaging. I believed it. I believed the characters' problems. I sympathized with the characters. And this is the crux of the messaging as well, or how the messaging is delivered, because the team has decided here that it's going to be incredibly character-focused. It's all character-driven stuff, and our characters' situations deliver the messaging as well. Not an uncommon tactic at all. Extremely common, and it does work here. However, I think that there's a little bit of a trade-off when you focus so much on the characters specifically and there isn't a lot of world building here, and I didn't often get a sense of scale for what other people are like. The NPCs in the background, the dumb masses are very much portrayed as dumb masses. They just do whatever the other people in power tell them to do, and that even applies to the happy ending of the movie, where it just seems like they were swayed by popular opinion as opposed to having their own individual epiphanies and self-actualization that demonstrated to them, oh, we were doing a bad thing and now we're going to try to improve on that. So a little bit of a downside for me, and specifically I think it was kind of disappointing that we didn't get a lot of background or explanation, as far as I could tell, on why the big bad guy in this movie is the way that they are. I don't quite understand their reasoning for being so incredibly vicious, especially toward our lead characters here. And I don't think we can just say like, oh, fear of the other, really standard response. I don't think that's enough. And especially when we try to translate this to real world situations in which, you know, they're just regular people sort of ignorantly or unknowingly proliferating really harmful norms and ideologies, it's not always just fear. It's usually more complex than that. And I think that delving into some of those complexities just a little bit and explaining some of that through character would be extremely helpful for supporting this movie's messaging overall. That's just my 2 cents. And honestly, I think that's about all I have for Nimona. It is a fantastic movie. It's definitely worth watching. Not quite for me. I don't think I'm in the intended audience here, other than just on the level of I really like animation and I really like to see creative art direction, that sort of thing. Moving on. Okay, This world can't tear me down. I don't even know when it released. I missed the release completely. Didn't know this existed until the other day when I was watching it. This is the sequel series to Tear Along the Dotted Line, a series from an Italian cartoonist called Zero Calcari, something along those lines in terms of pronunciation. And it is a completely different story. So the first season, series, whatever you want to call it, I'm worried to spoil it because it is very focused on a little tiny topic, interpersonal relationship, but that kind of reveals itself over the course of the episode, so I don't want to detail exactly what it's about. But regardless, it's one little story. This series is another little story. This one is about fighting neo-Nazis in modern-day Rome, and it is based on true events at the very least. I don't know how much was being nudged or changed for the sake of protecting personal identity and all that kind of stuff. But either way, it is a show that is like the first one, is extremely self-aware, and the voice, the writing voice of Zero Calcari is not only self-aware, but a friend of mine once called it like accelerated self-awareness. It wraps around itself so many times in trying to address different things, trying to explain different things, trying to explain choices that the writer made themselves in real life, and also trying to explain the context for just like the political climate in Italy right now. So there's a lot happening, and it also has a very fractured and slightly stunted approach to narrative and narrative timelines. I guess we could call it nonlinear, is sort of a broad term, but it will very frequently just have moments of like, okay, I was telling you that one story, now we're going over here, and this is for context, and I need to talk about this thing over here. They might change the art styles, they'll change backgrounds very frequently, and sometimes that works very well, and it's helpful, and it enriches the viewing experience of the rest of the show, and other times it's genuinely confusing. I also had moments where I literally couldn't follow what was being said between the bits and the narration and how quickly everything was edited. It was a lot. And I don't mean like, oh, I had to stop looking at my phone and actually pay attention. No, like I was already paying a lot of attention to the show, and I still got left behind, especially in the first couple of episodes. Little weird. I don't know if that's just like, maybe that just comes down to editing and how everything was assembled. Maybe it's somehow my fault, but I wasn't a big fan of the times when the show just completely lost me and went off on too many tangents, and it just didn't work for me. Still, coming back around to the positive, it does provide a lot of information, and it does provide a lot of crucial context, specifically for viewers outside of Italy who, I mean, if you don't live inside of Italy, you probably don't know a lot about Italian culture, pop culture, politics, etc. It ends up being rather isolated on the world stage. Certainly in my experience, like there's just a huge gap between the US and Italy in particular when it comes to those things. And I also think this level of self-awareness and the fragmented nature of the storytelling, it contributes to this varied and like opposing tone, I think, of the show overall, and narrative voice, where on the one hand it's trying to be very accommodating and it's trying to lead the viewer, and many different kinds of viewers, through the details of the story and cover a lot of crucial ground. At the same time, there's a tone of, oh, but ultimately we don't really give a like I'm just saying my piece, and that's that, just deal with it. Now, I could see people potentially saying that's like a failing, or it feels kind of hypocritical or something like that. I didn't feel that way. I actually felt like it was a pretty good balance. I think that ultimately these are two opposing forces kind of playing tug of war. So it's not like the flag ever strays way too far in one direction or another. It mostly stays right in the middle. And I think that's a great balance. I think it ultimately feels like a show that wants you to be there, and it genuinely wants to tell you a story. And if you get into that mood of just somebody's telling me a story. Somebody's telling me a story from their real, actual life, and I'm just going to sit back and listen, then it's really enjoyable. It's a lot easier to watch. I mean, it's also a comedy. It's easy to watch in general. I think the animation is quite lovely, even though the art direction isn't exactly my thing. Also, another HDR show. Wow, it looks really nice in HDR on a good screen. Let's see, what else can I rush through before I run out of time here on the recording? A unique aspect of the original show that continues into this one is that you have Zero Kalkari himself doing the vast majority of voice acting. When he's telling stories about other characters, he is doing the voices for those other characters, and that translates to the dub, where we have an English actor doing voices for a slew of other characters, and then there will sometimes be other voice actors doing performances as well. An interesting approach. Definitely, I sung the praises of the English voice actor leading the English dub in the first series, and I still think he does a fantastic job here. I was a big fan of the performance. However, there were moments where the show was trying to get very emotional, usually a one-on-one between our lead and one of his buddies, and there's sad, slow piano music playing in the background because that's what you do during a sad scene, and I just don't think either the dub or the original audio successfully capture the emotion of those moments, unfortunately. Like, I still felt them, I still heard the words, and they resonated with me, but it just wasn't quite enough. It just didn't quite make it there for me. So, a small detriment to the execution overall. When you ultimately come around to the messaging and like the climax of this series, which you know what it's going to be from the very start, so there's a kind of dread as you lead up to those moments, but they did a great job. It feels heavy when it needs to feel heavy. They lighten it up when the weight can be a bit too much, and they say quite a bit. They say quite a bit about not just, not grand political statements so much, but just really taking it down to the level of micro politics and interpersonal relationships and what things are like on the streets, so to speak. And I think that makes it successful. I loved watching this series again. I really hope that it continues on. One other small note I have that I'll mention extremely briefly, because it's based on real life, there are a lot of mentions of Zero's actual success, his rampant success that he's had as a result of that first Netflix show and other deals and stuff. There's potential there to become less relatable to a big portion of the audience, and especially for bitter, failed creatives like myself. That's just a natural reaction to hearing about someone else's success. It's like, oh, great, yeah, thank you so much. I'm not interested anymore. But we got past it. There's still a huge amount of value here, and a lovely watch if you want some adult animation that's more serious and is right up there, as far as I'm concerned, with the greats of dramatic adult animation. Was that ever a dance move? Was there ever a cheeky dance move called the clap? Just rife with euphemism. Wake up, Carlo. Wow. Out of left field for me. I'd never heard of this again. I had never heard of this thing before. Brazil has some really fantastic animation. This is something that we all just need to accept and address at this point, and probably talk about much more. Some of that animation ends up on Cartoon Network, some of it ends up in sort of weird indie games, and some of it just kind of splashes onto Netflix with probably one of the best constructed trailers that I've seen since maybe 2013. Wake Up Carlo, I guess I should I can attempt to give a breakdown of the story here. You have a small boy in pajamas, and he's friends with a green monster, and things happen. They go apart from one another and they come back together, all within the first episode, by the way. And the world around them has changed, and it's a very different situation, and basically they need to go on wacky, colorful adventures through this mystical land to try to make things better, sort of. They also just have their stupid own, selfish motivations at the heart of everything, revolving around a specific guava-filled cookie. So, right off the bat, you probably know whether or not this is the kind of thing that you would watch in your downtime on a Thursday afternoon. And for me, it is 100% the kind of thing that I would watch in my downtime on a Thursday afternoon, and also most of the day Friday, because it's a much longer show than I was really expecting. I don't know if I would say that it's long in the tooth, but it definitely is a lot to handle. So when I was talking about This World Can't Tear Me Down, whatever that show's called, I mentioned getting left behind a little bit. There were moments where it was jumping around a little too quickly, and I didn't follow. With this one, good luck. It's not a matter of paying attention. It's just, you're going to get lost. It's the kind of show that really likes just flat out unbridled creativity. And while we generally see that as a very positive thing in artistic work, there is a downside to that. There is a drawback, which is just if you lose the connective tissue and you don't feel like there's a strong sense of logic behind what's happening, you will probably be lost, especially because we're just not used to this kind of thing in a lot of narrative work being produced today. Like it's just not very common to jump around so insanely, especially not in something that seems to be aimed at a younger audience. Critiquing other criticism for a little bit, I'm gonna make an assumption here that if other people on the internet have talked about this show, sure there's a handful, they have almost definitely said the usual things. They've almost definitely said that this is like, oh, it's so trippy. They love the word trippy. And they have almost definitely had, done that rhetorical question of like, how is this for kids? This is a kid show? Multiple question marks. I continue to hate that kind of thing. I've talked about plenty of times before. And in this case especially, I do not think the word trippy is useful at all, because ultimately it's meant to imply like, oh, these creative people making this weird thing are taking all kinds of drugs, or specifically like hallucinogens. And I always think that's so funny, because I feel like it tends to come from people who don't have any experience with those substances or anything similar. Because the big secret that not a lot of people seem to talk about is you don't need drugs. You don't need crazy substances. You don't need artificial intervention to do incredibly creative work. It's already there. Your subconscious is already completely insane. And if you dip into that, you can get some of the wildest ideas around. That's what Dali did. That's what David Lynch loves doing and loves talking about so much. It has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with substances. And I don't think that it's a helpful association to draw. I don't think we need to keep making that comparison. It's incredibly simplistic and also almost definitely inaccurate. So with this show in particular, all you need to get a show like this to get made is you get probably a medium to large group of incredibly creative people who also have some really solid skills when it comes to visual arts, and you let them do what they want to do. They will come up with weird and crazy ideas, and as is tradition, visual artists tend to think very visually. They're not always concerned with really logical and tight narrative twists that make a bunch of sense. And with this show especially, they just want to do things. They just had an idea and then they executed that idea. So that's what happens next in the show. I would love to see the storyboards for this, by the way. I want to pin those up on my wall. Maybe it goes without saying, it's a great looking show. I mean, maybe you're not into like the vaguely pop surrealist designs, more so the color palette. It feels pop surrealism to me based on my limited knowledge, but I think it looks fantastic, especially buildings. There's some lovely wide shots of like cityscapes or buildings or hillsides that just look fantastic. And it goes without saying again that these colors completely pop. This is yet another show that Netflix presents in HDR, and I'm a huge fan. Wow, it's lovely. It is a great looking show. I wish I had more detailed perspectives to share on that, but that's what I got. It looks absolutely fantastic. And even though I did get lost in terms of narrative jumps sometimes I really didn't care. I really didn't care. I was so happy to just try to follow along and get immersed into the next wacky idea, whatever that happened to be. Surprisingly, the story actually does wrap up quite well. I won't get into spoilers. Don't you worry about it. You can experience it for yourself. But it's lovely. It's I don't know if we could call it corny. There's enough self-awareness here where I feel like it can be absolved from corniness for talking about certain platitudes, grand ideals, commentary on creativity in general. I was just shocked at how many seemingly weird images from the early bits of the show actually came around and had quite a bit of significance by the very end. Weirdly satisfying. Did a fantastic job of tying up loose ends, which I was not expecting in the least. And probably the best thing I can say about Wake Up Carlo as a whole is that I didn't find myself looking away. I did not notice myself peeling away from the screen and doing other stuff, which I like to do, honestly, especially if it's something I've watched before. I'll walk around, I'll do chores, I'll try to do something else, and it just didn't happen here. It wasn't a conscious choice. I just found myself paying attention. I found myself kind of glued to the screen for a long time, for many episodes in a row. And that's a huge compliment, because that just wasn't the case with a lot of the things that even I watched just for this video. I think this will be a pretty quick one. My happy marriage. I think we have all of season 1 at this point. I watched all the episodes currently available, at the very least, and I was kind of drawn to this one because the title is audacious. At least in everything that I've experienced, story equals conflict. When you're studying writing in particular, that is just rammed down your throat so many times. You are ingrained with that understanding. Like, you just need some kind of conflict. It doesn't have to be world-ending crazy stuff. It can be personal drama and small-scale things. But either way, you need some kind of drama. And seeing this title, I was blown away. I was like, no way is this just a show about nice things happening. No way is this Terrace House. It's not going to happen. Nobody would do that. Nobody would put in the effort to animate a show that has no conflict. And guess what? That's not what happened at all. Yeah, no, it has tons of conflict. So the title is, I wouldn't say misleading, but you have to view it from an angle. Like, they're being a little bit cheeky about this. And another kind of concern I had here is that I don't know if we would necessarily put this into one of the romance genres of anime, but regardless, a romance is at the very core, and some of the most meaningful or dramatic moments all have to deal with this romance between our two characters. And, you know, on the one side, we have a very conventionally attractive woman who adheres to all kinds of cliches and cultural ideals, and she's just so loving and loyal, and she's really good at crafts and other domestic things. And then on the other side, we have a man who's better than everybody else, like, inherently, and that applies to his special magical powers. There are supernatural powers in the show, by the way. I'm not sure why, but I'm okay with it. And he's cooler and hotter than everybody else, and he doesn't want to get married to this perfect woman over here. So that's another side of things. I watched another romance adjacent anime recently called Horimiya, and there's just an inherent contradiction, right? Like, there's an inherent challenge to writing that kind of stuff because you run out of conflict. Like, the exciting bits are when they're getting to know each other, and the will they won't they is still active, and that's what keeps you watching. But as many people have pointed out in the past, when a couple like that actually does end up getting together, it's less interesting. Like, they're less interesting as characters. The details of their relationship aren't as exciting. I do think in general that you can do some really interesting work about the maturing of a relationship, all the things that come up after that initial infatuation has long since passed. But as viewers of this kind of genre, we typically like the early stuff. We like the sizzle, the early feelings of discovery and like, they finally confessed their love and they overcame the hurdles getting in their way. So what do you do when they actually get together? And at least in terms of the first season of this show, we know they will be together. We know that our lead character is desperately loyal to her soon-to-be husband. That's all fine. They haven't totally gotten together quite yet, at least not in the episodes that I saw. So we know that they will. Does that make the show as a whole less interesting? Like, do you feel compelled to continue watching the show if you know exactly what's going to happen next? And I think this required kind of like a reassessment of my view of these kinds of stories, because it's not the kind of story that's supposed to be, you know, putting you on the edge of your seat. It's not the kind of thing where you're supposed to be wondering, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? The twists will be insane and it'll be a completely different show in no time. It's really not that kind of situation. Rather, you're supposed to know exactly where things are going. You are supposed to feel kind of satisfied and secure in the knowledge that these characters will indeed get together and that they will indeed have a happy marriage. And that's not an issue. That's not what that's not the kind of stories, that isn't the kind of story that I tend to engage with, at least not often. But I don't think that I can look down on it. I don't think that means it's somehow like an inferior form of narrative. I think it works just fine, and it serves a very specific purpose that probably makes a lot of people feel happy and entertained. That's a-okay. And I don't know, this is just a point of discussion, I guess, for everybody else. Is this kind of thing, this like historical fiction setting and traditional dress and all that, is that potentially an equivalent of Western stories about the fancy old times, whether it's fancy old England or fancy old, well, relatively fancy old frontier times in the US? Like, is there a connection there? Wanting a simpler time, but also just wanting the aesthetic trappings of a previous historical era? Like, is there just the surface level satisfaction of seeing, oh, these are the fancy old clothes that people used to wear, and they used to speak very politely to one another at large gatherings? I don't know. Again, just a point of discussion. I don't have enough confidence in any kind of knowledge of Japanese culture to say that it is a direct point of comparison. Just potential there. I don't know. All right. The last show that I want to talk about today is Aggretsuko. Obviously, I've been aware of this show for quite a while by now. It completed its 5th season, by the way. So it has been around for a good long while. And as far as I can tell, it is still highly regarded. It's still getting good critics ratings. It seems like it has quite an audience, even just here in the West. I kind of expect it's much more popular in Japan, but I don't know. It just came across to me as very gimmicky, overly gimmicky. It almost seemed like the kind of thing where it's a really shallow idea of just like, oh, cute thing but metal, which honestly at this point is a juxtaposition that is very well-worn territory. And especially as something coming from Sanrio, the Hello Kitty people, I was just kind of cynical. I was like, okay, so they wanted something for adult audiences. Their cutesy stuff is really just for kids, whatever. This is them cynically trying to appeal to that kind of audience. And well, for one thing, they've been successful. So I can only be so dismissive of that idea. But really, the big takeaway here is that this is actually a really good show. This is actually some very good adult animation, and I didn't expect to be saying that at all. Big asterisks to share here. For one thing, didn't even make it through the first episode. I almost made it through the episode. I got to the part where she was doing her screaming metal voice, and I was like, okay, yeah, I knew we were gonna get here, and I'm generally bored by everything else that is happening. So what I did was, I skipped ahead to season 5. Because, especially with a show like this, which, by the way, is about like this mild-mannered office worker who just deals with a bunch of nonsense as part of her regular life, everyday life, and also her working life. There are issues that come up just because she's a woman in the workplace, and there are outmoded concepts and traditions being perpetuated mostly by men in the office, stuff that she has to put up with. And of course, the cultural norms hold that she's not really allowed to express this stuff. She's not really allowed to be outwardly angry and upset about these things. So her response, her outlet for this is to do crazy metal vocals with a little microphone that she has. With that kind of setup, and especially with this is a character who is not wealthy or super successful, they're just very much an average person. I'm always curious where a show is going to take that over the course of multiple seasons. Do you make that character successful? Is that too unrealistic, or is it more valuable to show this character being successful because it could potentially inspire other fairly regular people that they will also be successful one day if they make the right choices with their career? I'm just curious. That's another one of those big writing challenges that comes up for this kind of subgenre. And it seems like it's a mix. It seems like there have been lots of strides. There has been plenty of character growth along the way, although I saw none of it happening. I just saw kind of the end result. But ultimately, still a regular person, still a very relatable, sort of typical character. And I was especially surprised to discover that the first half of season 5 basically is this very interesting and shockingly honest, I assume anyway, depiction of internet cafe poverty in the big cities of Japan, which was, again, just the level of surprise here, it's shockingly moving and very well done. At least, again, from an outsider perspective. I don't have firsthand knowledge of this stuff. However, I do have firsthand knowledge of that hand-to-mouth existence, as they say in the dub version of the show at one point, of where just you don't get to save money. There isn't enough money that you make to save any of it. So all of it goes to your expenses, and you're just trapped. Wherever you are in life at that moment, that is where you will continue to be for the foreseeable future, because it's never enough. Or rather, it's never more than enough. You only have the bare minimum to continue surviving and going about your usual business. I don't want to just detail the whole season to you. I absolutely think it's worth watching, but very much just a really moving depiction of not just the negatives and not just the horrors of that kind of life, but also the positives. Also this weird camaraderie that can come from multiple people being in a similar situation like that. And again, that's just the first half of season 5. We have one character who's our lens into that world, and then we move on to a completely different subplot that does ultimately end up tying together with the internet cafe stuff, so that was kind of neat. But regardless, two very, very different stories throughout the course of the whole season, and both were executed beautifully. Both of them were executed in a way that where I just, not only did I want to keep watching, but I was suddenly invested in these characters who I had barely known. I did not have any time to get to know these characters over the first 4 seasons of the show. I just skipped all of that stuff, and they still worked. They still resonated. They still felt believable. They felt sympathetic. I was rooting for them. And at the same time, somewhat similar to the Zero Kalkari show, it also gave me a really nice boots on the ground view of a little bit of the political situation in Japan, but more specifically the massive generation divide of Japan and how that feels from the perspective of a young person who's just working and just hoping that, maybe one day I can do the adult things like buy a house and have a successful career and all that. Just incredibly impressed. I don't know. In general, I'm always on board for more narrative work that explores bad jobs, bad working conditions, power disparities that arise out of not only bad jobs, but out of gaps in economic class and wealth disparity and that sort of thing as well. Obviously, every single culture has its own, sort of taboos and restrictions and things you're generally not supposed to talk about in a public way. And at least from what I can tell, this is an incredible outlet. This is an incredible manifestation of a lot of very real issues that are currently happening in Japan that maybe there aren't a lot of other outlets in which to express them. And again, as someone who doesn't live there, we rarely get a lot of opportunities to even become aware of those issues ourselves. In a way, this kind of show is sort of like the opposite of escapism. It's not taking you somewhere else. It's taking you back down to earth where there are very real problems. And I get why some people might not be in the mood for that. They might not want that from their entertainment, certainly not all the time. Regardless, this is a healthy thing to exist. I'm so glad that Aggretsuko is talking about these kinds of things and doing it very well. And as I said with This World Can't Tear Me Down, it's fantastic adult animation. Not all the great adult animation stuff comes out of the US anymore. It's not shallow, it's not just a gimmick, and it's worth watching. Even if the art and the animation is not really my thing. That brings us to the end. Thank you so much for joining me for the entire video. It's been a long one, huh? And it's been a long time coming. But yeah, I've enjoyed it. Will I hang on to Netflix or not? I don't know. Who cares? Either way, life will go on. And I'll try to get another video for you as soon as I can. Otherwise, I usually stream on Tuesdays if you feel like coming around and saying hello or watching from a distance, because I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the viewers here have some social anxiety going on. That's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.